We are 2.5 years into Vladimir Putin's war against Ukraine. In the years running up to the war, Russia flooded the information space with fake stories designed to whip up fear, particularly amongst the Russian-speaking people in the Donbass. But Ukraine was just the first, and right now, the country that finds itself next in the firing line is fighting to preserve its independence and democracy from a very strong push from the Kremlin. So let's talk about that, and at the end we'll talk about why it matters to all of us who live in democracies way more than you might think, just seeing this story as it might appear in the news. On Sunday, 20th of October, the citizens of the Republic of Moldova went to the polls for a presidential election and at the same time a referendum on whether the country's intent to join the European Union should be added to its constitution. Moldova is a tiny country, population of just 2.5 million people, about the same size as the population of the city of Chicago. It used to be part of the Soviet Union. Like other countries in that position, it has found in recent years that Vladimir Putin has not exactly come around to any sort of acceptance that its independence from Moscow should continue into the future. The majority of Moldovans are Romanian-speaking and have tended to support right-leaning parties that look towards integrating with Western Europe. There is also a sizable Russian-speaking population who have tended to support left-leaning candidates who lean towards Moscow. The question that all democracies are currently asking themselves is this: can you preserve the nature of democracy itself when it's under attack in the way that Russia particularly, but others as well, are currently attacking it? In many ways, the election in Moldova has been a test case on that question, and it's not looking wholly encouraging. You might wonder, well, if Moldova is such a small country, population-wise, why would Vladimir Putin even care that much about it? On the one hand, Putin has never accepted the loss of the zones of influence that Russia had via the Soviet Union, and his greatest desire would be to restore all of it, preferably, into being back in Moscow's orbit. More tactically, since Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the makeup of its neighbour Moldova has become even more important to him. An independent Moldova has helped Ukraine by dint of the fact that it doesn't need to devote much resource to defending its 750-mile border with the country. The current Moldovan government has helped support the flow of people and supplies in and out of Ukraine as well. If Moldova were controlled more strongly by Moscow, it would significantly hamper Ukraine's supply routes through the Black Sea, would potentially open up a new front, stretching Ukraine's capacity to fend off the invaders maybe to breaking point. In early 2022, Russian forces were aiming to take the port city of Odessa and then move on up towards Moldova. At the point where the received wisdom had been that Russian troops would just march into these places and meet minimal resistance, it was certainly considered a significant possibility that taking Moldova as well as Ukraine was part of the plan. That was certainly suggested to be the case by certain Russian officials, such as Deputy Foreign Minister Andrei Rudenko. When Ukraine's resistance scuppered the maximalist plan, Moscow's approach to Moldova reverted to its aggressive, non-military game plan. Moldova has in recent past been completely reliant on Russian gas for its energy. So, unsurprisingly, Moscow used this dependency to try to push the government at Chisinau to become friendly to the Kremlin. But it refused. Well, when it refused, Moscow pushed the prices of that energy up, reduced the gas supply, putting pressure onto a country where poverty is a widespread reality. Inflation reached 35% as a result. Parts of the country were hit by electricity blackouts. Much of a Russian-speaking segment of the electorate continues to get news from Russian-language sources, including Russian state television and associated websites. And for years, Moscow has used those vehicles to increase tensions between the Russian speakers and Romanian speakers, highlighting what it suggests is Russophobia by the Moldovan leaders, which had some basis in truth in the earliest years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but considerably less so today. And just as it did in Ukraine, in the Donbass region, Moscow has consistently tried to exploit the conflict in Moldova's separatist Transnistrian region. This is a narrow strip of land sitting between Moldova and Ukraine, covering around 1,600 square miles. It has a large population of ethnic Russians and Ukrainians, and it declared its independence from Moldova in 1990. Russia has a modest contingent of troops in Transnistria, under the excuse of protecting Russian speakers from the oppression of the Moldovan government. In other words, many of the same elements are in place that Moscow used in its flimsy justification as to why it invaded Ukraine. For now, however, it would mostly serve Moscow's interest for the Moldovan elections, not to continue to support the people who are pro the West and resistant to the Kremlin. In spite of its efforts to date, the majority of Moldovans respond to polling, saying that they now wish to join the European Union and supporting the pro-West focus. The current president, Maia Sandu, who was elected on an anti-corruption campaign in 2020, has been running in this election on a pro-EU campaign. Hence the decision to seek to embed the goal to join the EU in the country's constitution, which required a referendum vote to take place alongside the presidential one. Polling continued to suggest that Sandu's re-election and the success of the EU referendum were both highly likely, and that is the status quo that Moscow was seeking to disrupt, which it did in its usual fashion. One of the things it seems to have done is to seek to flood Moldova with Russian funding for pro-Russia candidates and to influence potential voters. One main point of focus was the Moldovan oligarch Ilan Shor, who fled the country in 2019 after being convicted of fraud and money laundering. He now lives in Moscow, but over the last 2 years, various parliamentary representatives friendly to Russia have made visits. And then last spring, the customs authorities started seeing a phenomenon. They ended up detaining more than 100 Russians who had arrived at the airport, each carrying up to 10,000 euros. Officials said that the money was aimed at buying pro-Russian votes and paying anti-EU demonstrators. Ilan Shor was thought to have been central to organising that scheme. And this account was given credence when an undercover journalist reported how Russian activists associated with Shor recruited and paid her to join demonstrations against the Sandu government. The Kremlin's objective was to field as many candidates as possible in this election to seek to keep Sandu's vote share below 50%, which would force a second round of voting. Such candidates are promising cheap Russian gas, amongst other things. Moldovan police say that Russian banks have sent over $15 million to more than 130,000 Moldovan citizens. In the event, it seems likely that all of that was enough to make an impact, short of Moscow's ideal solution, but maybe only just short. The election results reported today show that the opposition has been successful in forcing Maia Sandu into a second-round runoff vote. She got 41% of the votes, her closest opponent got 26%. What will happen in the runoff in a few weeks if all the opponents unite against her remains to be seen. And Moscow came within the thinnest whisker of pushing the EU referendum over the line, with 99% of the votes counted, the official data put the Yes campaign on 50.31% of the vote, the No campaign on 49.69%. Significantly below any of the advanced polling, highly likely to have been influenced by some of the Moscow money that didn't get intercepted, you might think. It's certainly what Maya Sandu is suggesting. She described the events during the campaign as, quote, an unprecedented assault on democracy. She said the government had clear evidence of 300,000 votes had been bought, which would constitute fraud of an unprecedented scale. Unsurprisingly, the Kremlin countered with claims of their own, that the election was not free and not fair, saying that the opposition had been denied the opportunity to campaign and had been repressed by the government. Why does all of this matter? It matters because democracy is in decline around the world. It matters because it's actively under attack across the world. Putin's information operation follows the tactic of flooding the information space with garbage. Not so much that you start to believe something very specific to be true that isn't true, but ultimately that, like the Russian people themselves, you just lose sight of the belief that anything at all is true. So you end up cynical about everything, trusting nothing, and ultimately demotivated to resist anything. What Moscow seeks to do is to get us to lose our capacity to tell the difference between homegrown, completely valid democratic dissent and even political crisis and actual, genuine, malign enemy interference. Because from a distance, those things can be hard to tell apart. I don't know, for instance, whether the Moldovan government was justified in believing the polling in relation to this election. It's not as though polls have never been shown to be wrong in history. I am largely persuaded because the practical interception of the flow of money, the stated intent by some of the characters involved themselves and what they were trying to do, and the fact that it fits an extremely well-known playbook of the Kremlin, as has been witnessed in a number of places, including in interference with my own democracy and with that of the United States. But those things can easily be mistaken. So it is that significant numbers of people take it all at face value and fall for it hook, line and sinker. This is the nature of the crisis of democracy that we face over the coming couple of decades. If our democratic processes can't protect themselves from the dumping of garbage information, of innuendo, of conspiracy theories, to the degree where their systems that used to work fine based on common values and trust just don't work anymore, things are going to get pretty hairy. In that sense, what's happening in Moldova this week is one of the canaries in the democratic coal mine. A small country, 2.6 million people, trying to resist the coercion of a bullying, powerful neighbour. The mere fact such an attempt might fail signals that we are moving away from the rules-based world that we believed had been firmly embedded, however imperfectly, towards a might makes right world, which is the one we thought we'd consigned to history. So the stakes really are a lot higher than you might think they would be for a small country as is Moldova. What happens there matters. All of us should be watching it with keen, concerned interest.